I know what you must be thinking right now. You must be thinking, damn, he looks good. Alright, that's enough of that bullshit. There we go. I can see. Last time we took a look at an anime that was a terrible failure in its attempt to make an entertaining anime that has a genuine message, only to end up a pretentious piece of dog shit that not only fails to be entertaining, but one of the most infuriating sits I've ever had on Anime Abyss. Today's anime, on the other hand, is the complete opposite of that. An anime that is not only well produced, being handled by Production IG of all things, well animated, scored, voiced, and above all directed by one of the absolute legends of the anime industry, Mamoru Oshii, and it's not Ghost in the Shell, but rather a film based on a bit more underappreciated but respected series nonetheless. And if you've been around anime for as long as I have, or if you've been in the anime community for a hot minute, you've probably heard of this anime series at one point or another. And I couldn't think of a better anime to cover on Anime Abyss. The Mobile Police, Patlabor. That's right, we're going to pay homage to one of the more lesser-known anime series in the States that, while on the surface doesn't hold the same fanfare of greats like Mobile Suit Gundam or Macross. Nevertheless, Patlabor still holds some high regard and reverence to the medium of anime. However, unfortunately, while it attempted to break out over here in the West, it just never really quite got the attention it deserved, which is just a shame as it's really a good series. And even though the IP still happens to enjoy some continued success in Japan for whatever reason, despite media companies like Made in Japan over here in the West shilling the coin to get the license to the series and the original high-definition masters to print high-quality copies of the show, OVAs, and the films on Blu-ray, buy it, please, you'll be sending Japan a message. It still doesn't come close to the success over in Japan. Hell, to this day, it still manages to get projects of the IP released every few years, like the short Patlabor reboot, which I hear is getting a expansion into an actual series, and in 2014 had a live-action TV series, Patlabor: The Next Generation, which eventually got its own film in Tokyo War. So it's needless to say that despite the fact that it's not as well celebrated like Gundam or Macross, it still managed to remain relevant as an anime franchise in Japan. Yet, if you type in Patlabor into the search bar of YouTube, there are not many videos actually discussing the franchise in any meaningful way, aside from the odd one here and there, but aside from that, it's mostly just clips from the various incarnations of the franchise, and that's about it. So, I'm going to rectify that here on Anime Abyss. Now, I won't be taking a look at the TV series, that I'll leave for a later date. Today, though, I'm going to be covering not only one of the most underrated classics in animated films, but also probably perhaps one of the most still socially relevant and daring and above all, well-produced pieces of film, anime or otherwise, and directed by one of the most celebrated names in the anime industry, Mamoru Oshii. We're going to be covering the one, the only, Patlabor 2. Before I get into discussing Patlabor 2 in depth, it must be said that Patlabor 2 deserves its underrated classic title. Not only is it one of the best looking and sounding animated films overall for its time and even today, and above all directed by Mamoru Oshii, most well known for his work on one of the most important pieces of media and anime, Ghost in the Shell, I feel it's a shame that the success of Gitz overshadowed this absolute classic, because in my opinion, I feel Patlabor 2 holds up better than Gitz. Guys, hold on. Let me rephrase that. It holds up better as a socially relevant piece of storytelling that, in my opinion, is better told as a story than Ghost in the Shell. Look, I'll get into the specifics later on, but I'll say this right now. As a piece of storytelling, Patlabor 2 holds up better in almost every way. Well, almost. Just because of how clear its message was and well told in that regard, and on top of that, its social commentary still holds up to this very day. Like I said in my last anime review on A Wind Named Amnesia, I said that there was a wrong way to tell a story with a message, and a right way to do it without sounding overtly pretentious, or the narrative taking a hit in quality for the narrative to be in service to said message, while also telling a good and entertaining story. And Patlabor 2 is the right way to do it. But before we get into talking about Patlabor 2, I need to address the obvious. Why am I not covering the first Patlabor movie and am instead just skipping to the second? So I'll throw you guys a bone and give a short mini review on the first. It's alright. Yeah, I know, that seems a little too simplistic of an answer in giving my thoughts on Patlabor the movie, as I will fully admit, as a Patlabor movie, it does its job at being a good adaptation and representation of the IP on the big screen. But as a story, production, and overall as a film, while I don't consider it bad, ultimately I've seen better. Funny enough, it was also directed by Mamoru Oshii, and while there are moments in the film that has obvious touches that only Mamoru Oshii would have put in, it's still at the end of the day a Patlabor film, not a Mamoru Oshii film. And for what it's worth, it's not bad, but it could have been great. Ultimately, if I had to describe it in simpler terms, Patlabor the movie feels like a Patlabor film that Mamoru Oshii was obligated to make, whereas Patlabor 2 feels like a Mamoru Oshii film that he absolutely wanted to make, that happens to bear the Patlabor name. Well, let's not put it off any longer. This is Patlabor 2. So, what is Patlabor 2 about? Well, the film opens 10 years in the past with several UN laborers in the middle of Cambodia for a PKO mission going completely tits up. The commander asking HQ for guidance on whether they should open fire on the incoming rebel forces, only for HQ to tell them to stand down and wait for Canadian forces to arrive, only for all of his men to be killed off one by one with RPGs. Once all is said and done, only one of them survives, but scarred and injured, having paid a heavy toll with HQ having failed him and his men due to the politics of the situation. Fast forward 10 years to series mainstay Noah Azumi operating a prototype labor alongside another series mainstay, Asuma, and I gotta admit, this opening credit scene is pretty dope, showing off how impressive the production on this anime was, cementing how good Production IG is at animation. But hell, not only that, but CG animation as well. Yeah, believe it or not, this anime was one of the few first animes to actually utilize CG pretty effectively. How? Well, simple. They only used it when it made sense to do so. For example, in the opening scene with the UN laborers, all those visual representations of humans on a screen was all CG modeling, and it doesn't feel out of place considering that he is viewing them through the cameras of the laborers with IR vision from a distance. Also, this opening scene with Noah testing out the prototype labor, all the virtual reality representation of her piloting a labor through a virtual town, doesn't rip you out from the immersion of the anime because she's piloting the prototype labor in virtual reality, so it actually works out in the end, despite how new it was at the time. Otherwise, most of the film is done in traditional cel-painted animation. Basically, they used CG to assist with the already existing techniques they were already using where it made sense, not replacing them with entirely new ones still in their infancy. I'm looking at you, X-Arm! It's been quite some time since the last film, as Noah and Asuma reflect on how long it's been, having mentioned that the AV-98 Ingrams they have been using were replaced with new ones. Noah and Asuma the past 2 years have been working on making new prototype Patlabors for SV2. It's also during this section of the film where we get to see where the other members ended up since the events of the previous film. Ota is still a loudmouthed idiot, now training the new recruits of SV2, Shinshi having since been promoted, Hiromi is still pretty much the lovable gentle giant tending to the garden, Goto is still being Goto, and Shinobu Nagamo giving a conference on the completion of Project Babylon since the last movie, who also has since been promoted. It's also by this point in a scene in an elevator where we get some exposition of a particular person from her past, a man named Suge.
Anyway, some of us Tsuge school alumni are planning to have a small get-together tonight.
Watabe and Tanaka from Technical R&D will be there, and they ordered us to accompany you.
I'm sorry, but I do have to bow out tonight.
Oh, come on.
If this is about you and Mr. Tsuge, it's been long enough, hasn't it?
Hey.
I've lost track of how long it's been.
Shinobu heading back to the SV2 HQ ends up being stuck in traffic, being informed by an SV2 patrol officer that the bridge is locked down because of a lone parked car on the bridge that is suspected to have a bomb. And then it happens. I really like the tone of this anime. It's from this moment on you know exactly what kind of anime you're getting yourself into. After the bombing of the bridge, followed by terror, confusion, and overall dismay of the populace, including the members of SV2, you really get the sense that shit has officially gotten real, and it's no longer happy-go-lucky fun time. The funny thing about the Patlabor IP is that when it comes down to the OVAs, the TV series, and onward, the tone of Patlabor has mostly stayed the same to what fans have expected for years. That of a fun, goofy, and of course an action-packed mecha anime that's a touch more down-to-earth and relatable than something like Gundam or Macross. However, for this film, Mamoru Oshii decided to an extent, to ditch the happy-go-lucky attitude with that of a tone of seriousness and cynicism that the IP really hasn't touched on too much since. And personally, that's why I feel this film stands out from the rest of the IP. It also helps that I really dig the aesthetic of this type of setting. Despite the fact that this is supposed to be the futuristic year of the year 2000, my god man, it's funny to think how naive people were. With giant mecha, advanced technology, etc., it still feels like a future where the 90s never got the memo that it's no longer the 90s. I mean, this is the type of retro future where they still use computers with DOS, VHS tapes, tube TVs, and even eat cup noodles. Normally, this type of thing would bother me, but overall, I think the reason I love the aesthetic of Patlabor is the same reason I like the retro future of Ridley Scott's Alien. While it seems very anachronistic on the surface, it also gives a warm, familiar representation of the world and the culture people lived in at the time it was made, while also feeling more authentic than something completely made up and fabricated like something out of Star Trek. Not to say I don't see the appeal of Star Trek, it's just an observation. In fact, it's funny as a baby of the 90s, having been born in 1992, to look back on media from the time period, as while I grew up in the 90s, I ultimately mostly remember the new millennium more, as that was ultimately the generation I grew up in. So to see a piece of media being made by the adults of the era and to tell a story from the perspective of people who actually lived through it is very intriguing to me. In fact, you have to consider the time period this was made, as after the bombs dropped in Japan during World War II, after pulling themselves up from their bootstraps from the lowest point they could be, Japan ended up being rejuvenated and stronger than ever. The economy skyrocketed, their country made massive amounts of advancement in their culture in just a short few decades, resulting in an era of growth they would call the bubble economy. And like the word bubble implies, that bubble was about to burst. While things were still good for a while going into the 80s, tensions were most definitely rising, as the youth of that generation started to result in an explosion of crime that was the highest it ever was at the time, bringing a disruption to the peace that most people were becoming accustomed to in the ensuing decades, something that eventually became the foundation for Yasuhiro Otomo's Akira. But that wasn't the only thing. The decades of peace resulted in stagnation, as that once spurt of growth people saw was now starting to see a diminishing of returns. Frustrations in the workplace culture, frustration in the youth at schools, a growing number of suicides, crime, and other such nonsense. And then it happened. The bubble burst. All of a sudden the economy went in the fucking toilet, the property market started to dwindle, and the morale of the nation was at an all-time low. And this era in time was something that ultimately affected Mamoru Oshii, and was one of the frustrations he vented about in his own way with Patlabor 2. I have to say this, while his anime may not all be winners, and one can feel more pretentious than the other, Mamoru isn't an idiot, and definitely has a lot to say. When interviewed by Hayao Miyazaki for Nausicaa.net, the Japan in the aftermath of the bubble bursting was starting to change in a way that Mamoru Oshii was very dissatisfied with. A Japan that once felt strong after the bombs dropped, resulting in this rapid state of progress, only to result in the population becoming more stagnant, less ambitious, more weak and sensitive, something Oshii called the era with no vision. Quote, "Dads of the post-war period have been doing the same thing, toward the dream of a nuclear family. They had the dream to be free from the constraints of various blood relations, and to have a vision shared only by the immediate family. And that dream was realized, wasn't it? However, the bubble had burst, and such things have all collapsed. So now we are entering into a time of recapping. Which direction we are going to recap it in is more important than to build a vision now. Like Arakawa said, the only issue is how we are going to put an end to it. It's the same vision with the issue of war. It's not whether we are going to have it or not, since it's already started. Until we put an end to it, there can't be a new vision." I want to expand on this a bit more with my memories of 9/11. I remember a specific shift that took place when that plane crashed into the Twin Towers. I remember the day it happened. My mom yelled at me and my brother to get into the living room, and she was sitting at the TV, which was that of the footage of the Twin Towers, with smoke billowing out of it. Now, I was really young, so I didn't really grasp the severity of it all until way later. But I do remember the specific moment when the towers fell, and seeing my mom's expression afterwards. Only to go to school right afterwards, and you could just feel it in the air. This sense of tension, this sense that things are not the same, and almost like we were just waiting for the second hammer to drop at any moment. It was then I felt something change in this country that has only become more and more exaggerated as time goes on. And while I wouldn't say that what Mamoru Oshii felt during the pop of the bubble economy in Japan is the same as 9/11, I do feel the sense of tension that came after that was supposed to be the exact moment that he wanted to convey in Patlabor 2, and he delivered. From the moment the bridge is bombed, the normal hustle and bustle feel of life in Japan is now filled with an air of tension, wondering who on earth could have done such a thing. A foreign country, an extremist terrorist group, a politically charged coup d'etat. It's from here on out that things are not the same, and only questions of what will happen next fills the air. Later on, Goto and Shinobu would get some sort of hint as to who may be responsible, as an odd-looking spook with a lazy eye by the name of Arakawa has a videotape to show them. A tape that happens to be of a plane that, while similar to the Air Force fighter jet that was shown all over the news, isn't exactly the same to what's been shown in the media. After moving the conversation to a car, driving on the highway to avoid eavesdropping on their discussion, Arakawa gives them info that the plane that was used was a US fighter jet being used for training that, quote-unquote, went missing from Miyake Island on the night the bridge was bombed. Arakawa mentioning that the attack on the bridge was most likely a politically motivated attack to jolt Japan from their feelings of safety and peace, most likely from a group they've had their eyes on for some time. Goto and Shinobu, however, are a tad skeptical of the conjecture, Shinobu asking the obvious of why the military doesn't go public about this, Arakawa saying that it would cause a public scandal that they wouldn't be able to handle. Goto is very suspect about the story, rightfully pointing out that it's nothing more than just conjecture and speculation. Arakawa, feeling more confident that Goto was the right man to go to, he hands the both of them a file. Something that shakes Shinobu to the core. Someone from her past.
Yukihito Tsuge, one of the founding members of the group I just mentioned. His current whereabouts are unknown. We're doing everything we can to find him. He's our prime suspect. Since you work with laborers, I imagine that you've heard his name before. Tracking people down like this isn't our first line of expertise, and since it's a delicate affair, we can't bring the police in.
Tsuge, who you might know as the guy from the beginning of the film, who was let down by his HQ on a PKO mission due to politics. And that's not all. That reaction from Shinobu, there's more to it.
She became one of the brightest stars of the Tsuge school, and the greatest partner for Tsuge himself. But there was a slight mishap. None of it got recorded, of course. Despite rank or position, he was a man and she was a woman. Stuff happens.
If it hadn't been for the fact that Tsuge was married, none of that would have mattered.
Yup. Tsuge and Shinobu were forbidden lovers. I love how layered the story is, as well as how it deconstructs the characters in a way that not only respects the original source material, but does it in a very convincing, earnest, and even realistic way. The fact that Shinobu, the strictly professional, strong-headed, and by-the-book commander of Division 1 we come to know over the course of the series, made a massive error during her younger years in the police force by having a romantic affair with an older man who happened to be her teacher, is not only well told and believable, but it also makes Shinobu a much more vulnerable and human individual, prone to making huge mistakes in a moment of weakness. Even the fact that Goto calls attention to the fact that their opposite genders and the nature of their positions is what led to the possibility of said affair to bloom is quite true to life. And before anyone calls me sexist for even pointing out the fucking obvious, and also let's not pretend like workplace affairs don't happen in real life, let's be completely honest. If men and women were completely equal and truly had no differences of any nature between the genders, we would all look like human Ken dolls, have no genitals, and the percentage of people having sexual intercourse would drop to fucking zero. Truth hurts, wear a fucking cup. And what makes this reveal all the better is that it shows how she feels about him through visual storytelling and drops subtle clues throughout the beginning minutes of the film about their relationship before the metaphorical bomb drops that makes the audience truly realize how much is truly at stake, not just at the hands of the country, but on a more human and emotional level involving our protagonists. I mean, just imagine having the knowledge that a person you once cared for deeply on an emotional level is now most likely a homegrown terrorist, and you and your team are being tasked to take him in without blowing your cover of being a normal police officer, not working for the spooks. It's a good story hook that kept me wanting to see more. And predictably, as questions are being reasonably asked, things just keep getting worse as the local JSDF airbase gets word that potential enemy fighter jets are about to enter Japanese airspace. The Air Force doing their best to find out what's going on, trying to get contact of the squadron heading their way, even going so far as to scramble their own jets to make contact. However, they are ordered to not pull the trigger, not knowing what's going on, thinking it's 3 US fighter jets, only to be informed that none of their planes took off, going through hoops and red tape just to make a call on the situation. The first fighter squadron engaging with the quote-unquote enemy fighter squadron only to be seemingly taken down. This act causing the nearby airport to put their remaining flights on hold out of fear that a terror attack is on its way. And right as the enemy blips on the radar are about to near Tokyo, and as the base commander finally gives the order to the remaining scrambled fighters to take out the enemy jets, those 3 red blips turn into 2 green ones. The same 2 blips that were quote-unquote shot down, rescinding the order to take down the fighter planes. It leaves everyone in a state of confusion. In fact, the state of affairs gets so bad that not only does the Air Force get put on a hold to ground their forces indefinitely, but it also results in political infighting as superiors from the military, police, etc. are not only not taking any sort of responsibility for what's going on, but eventually the government basically outs the police as having been incapable of keeping the peace as tensions have been rising, causing the government to put the entire country into military lockdown because they don't trust the cops. All of this due to an invisible enemy they have no idea where the attacks are coming from. My favorite part of how the rising tensions within the government and the country of Japan are presented to the viewer is done pretty realistically. Hell, just going through the lockdowns when COVID hit our shores in America, especially when the pandemic first started and there was all this fear about what the capabilities of the virus potentially was. The one thing I noticed as the months rolled by was that life doesn't just stop. People still have to live their lives, albeit very differently than what they're used to. But nonetheless, whether it's a pandemic or in this case a potential war/military lockdown, the citizens still have to live their lives. And I like how this movie presents that. The scenes following the military lockdown orders being put into effect are both equally well animated with great cinematography, but it also paints a scene that is not only so vividly real, but also one that is chilling to think about. The military now deployed in the city shows how tense the situation is within Japan due to the terror attacks, turning the normal everyday life of Tokyo into a metaphorical powder keg, contrasting the dire tone of it all with the reality that normal everyday people still live in the city. Life just doesn't stop because of terrorism. People are still trying to live their lives as usual, using the trains, walking the city streets, but with tanks, military choppers, labors, and troops patrolling the once peaceful-looking streets. Moments like this soldier standing attention in front of a clothing department store with his reflection in the glass in front of a pretty dress, 2 military otakus taking a photo in front of a tank with a soldier to the side with a serious look on his face, or my favorite, this labor pilot being waved at by children, waving back at them before taking a quick glance in the sky out of fear of an attack, before looking back and smiling at the kids. It's these sort of details that I love in the visual medium of film and anime. The ability to paint a story and picture and scene and overall tone without using exposition to explain at the audience what's actually happening is what separates films like Patlabor 2 from trashy popcorn flicks. This movie just does so much right. The production, the animation quality, design, aesthetic, the soundtrack, which is phenomenal, having been composed by famed composer Kenji Kawai, who also went on to compose soundtracks for other Mamoru Oshii classics such as Jinro the Wolf Brigade and Ghost of the Fucking Shell. We'll get to that. Heck, even the CG work is just well done. And the story is perhaps the best written script that Oshii ever penned, in my opinion. This movie is fantastic. I'm going to say this before I continue on. Buy this movie. It's that damn good. Hell, even if you aren't into the mech genre, it's done so well that even people who aren't into the genre might want to give this a try. But before you do that, before you go to eBay or before you go to Amazon and decide to purchase a copy of Patlabor 2, as I know some of you may not be 100% convinced and might be asking, what's the catch? Well, I might as well rip the Band-Aid off right now and get it over with. There is a reason you most likely haven't heard about this anime or haven't seen this anime talked or heard it talked about as often as you would think, considering the amount of people who speak about it, including myself, and that's just for one reason. It's lack of mainstream appeal. Before anyone has a misunderstanding of what I mean and decides to type in the comments the Webster's Dictionary definition of what mainstream means, let me save you the trouble. When I say quote-unquote mainstream, I don't mean the same sense as the mainstream public. I mean more so in the already geeky zeitgeist that already existed at the time in the US, like comics, cartoons, and the fledgling anime scene of the time. Like I alluded to earlier in the episode, I did say that I feel as a piece of storytelling, Patlabor 2 was not only more socially relevant of a story, but better written too. But I would be fucking lying to you if I said that Ghost in the Shell wasn't the more successful, if not the most successful anime film that Mamoru Oshii directed. Why, you ask? Well, for one reason. Well, multiple. For starters, it has a lot more action than Patlabor 2. It's not to say that there isn't any action in Patlabor 2, but the action mostly takes a back seat to the actual story, and when things are being shot to hell or blown up by the terrorists, it's usually the baddies doing things that affect the good guys, while the good guys just kind of react to the things happening around them and not really doing much about it. It's just weird when even the fucking military, which is in control of the city, just feels useless in the midst of an Apache helicopter bombing bridges and radio towers despite the weaponry at their disposal. Which, perhaps that was the point, to highlight the uselessness of the military and the government, but even then it just kind of feels off to me. Also, the worst part is, see that dope as hell AV-98 Ingram special made just for this anime? Want to know how much time it has to show off in the film? 5 minutes! Look, I gave some leniency to Mamoru Oshii when I said that this is a Mamoru Oshii film first and a Patlabor movie second, but it just feels criminal to have these awesome looking special operations AV-98s with flak vests, which just looks awesome, only to sidelight them to the end of the film, which is cool for while it lasts, but it's just not enough. Also, speaking of sidelined, I am absolutely shocked at how little there is of the main cast. Now granted, the main focus was Goto and Shinobu, but the fact that you see so little of the main gang from the series is just a bummer. This is where calling it Patlabor 2 instead of something like Patlabor Tokyo War does it a bit of a disservice if you are already a fan of the series. Putting a number in front of it just gives one the impression that the movie would be similar to the one that came before it. But it just simply isn't. In fact, I would say that if you haven't seen the TV series or anything else before watching Patlabor 2, you are much better off, as you wouldn't have had any preconceptions or context, allowing one to view it for what it is. But as a fan, while I do love this film, I don't love it because it's a Patlabor movie. I love it because it's a Mamoru Oshii film, and simply dismissing criticism of the film just because of who directed it would be disingenuous. As for the second reason why the film didn't do so well when compared to Ghost in the Shell, because there weren't any tits on the cover. Oh, you think I'm kidding, but stop. Dig deep for a second. Be painfully honest with yourself. Are you really going to lie and say you actually bought the DVD or VHS tape back when Manga Video was distributing Ghost in the Shell and say that you got it for Motoko's Bitchin' Shades? Yeah, no shit. The reason Gits did so well universally, especially in the West, as shallow as it is, came down to the genius idea to market the DVDs with a shot of Motoko's cleavage. And it worked. In fact, legend has it, when the original 1995 film released in theaters in Japan using this original poster to market it, apparently ticket sales, while successful, wasn't anywhere near as big a hit as they would have hoped. Then the movie was distributed by Manga Video in the West using this cover, and Production IG noticed how many copies were being sold and took note of the cover, leading them to re-release the film in theaters with this poster. I hope whoever the marketing genius was at the team at Manga UK who came up with that decision got a fucking raise, because it was genius. Oh sure, the original 1995 film did use sex appeal to deconstruct what it means to have sex appeal when her body is essentially nothing more than artificial limbs, wires, and circuitry, but that didn't stop Production IG for exploiting that shit to the max with later Gits titles like Standalone Complex and onwards. And if it wasn't for that, Kusanagi as a character would not have been as well loved of a sex symbol in anime, nor would Gits be anywhere near as popular as it ended up being. To drive the point further, allow me to channel my inner Razor Fist for a moment. The bitch's ass is tighter than the skin on Bruce Jenner's cheeks. In short, there's a reason the phrase sex sells is still very relevant when it comes to media. Right, DC Comics? As for the last reason the film just didn't do as well, is for this very unfortunate fact, and it's the same reason I love this film too. Not everyone appreciates smart. Ultimately, the main downfall of this film just comes down to the fact that while it is very well written, thought-provoking, and socially relevant of a piece of storytelling, the lack of commercially viable aspects from a lack of mech action in a mecha anime like Patlabor, the fact that there was a big lack of the main cast of the series, and yes, even a lack of sex appeal to make the film more enticing to the normies, is what ultimately caused this film to not be looked at as fondly as something like Gits. Even intellectually smart films like Fight Club understood the importance of being entertaining first, even when said entertainment was in service of well-written social commentary. What, did you think Brad Pitt was in the film just because of his acting chops? The fact that the movie, and the book for that matter, had so many memorable and well-written lines helped lend itself to being a film that would be remembered to this day. Just the fact that you could utter the phrase, "What's the first rule of Fight Club?" only for someone to respond with, "You're not supposed to talk about it," is a testament to how entertaining of a film it truly was. Oh sure, it didn't do well in theaters. Hell, even critics hated the movie when it released, but when it hit the home market on VHS and DVDs, that's when its sales absolutely skyrocketed. My point is, critical success does not equate to commercial success. If that was the case, The Room would be one of the biggest commercial flops in film history, and yet people still watch and buy copies, stream, and talk about it to this day. Something I unfortunately can't say about Patlabor 2. Real talk? It took me 2 settings, just to watch this film for the first time, and twice as well to write the notes. Why? The lack of entertainment value. Is that to mean that the film is bad and not worth watching? No, I think it's definitely worth watching. But in the end, despite how intellectually well written it is, and how well presented its message is, and how well presented its message it imparts onto the viewer is, it takes effort and patience to truly enjoy it. Effort most people aren't willing to put in. And I understand why most people wouldn't go for something like that. While fans of Patlabor 2 could easily just condemn those who didn't watch it because it lacked the things I previously mentioned as normies that simply don't understand good art, ultimately, I feel that would be very dismissive of its very real flaws that keeps it from achieving absolute legend status. Again, I love this film, and it is an easy recommendation for those who love film, anime, and stories of an intellectual nature. But I would be lying if I said this film was for everyone. But before I go, I want to end this off by mentioning the one scene everyone mentions when talking about Patlabor 2, and is overall the major theme this anime revolves around. The one major scene that turned this movie into a piece of thoughtful storytelling into something truly special. The illusion of peace speech. There's a reason this speech is so commonly referenced when talking about how good of a movie Patlabor 2 is, and it's simply because of how well written and how relevant it is today when it comes to the themes that Patlabor 2 is trying to talk about and convey. Now, ultimately, I would go out of my way to show you clips in full in order to show you what I'm talking about, but in all honesty, I would recommend you pull this speech up on YouTube or to get the DVD or Blu-ray and watch it for yourself, because it is that good. And it was this speech in particular that really left me pausing to stop and think much longer than I actually expected to. Sure, in reality, Mamoru Oshii was mostly pointing his criticisms towards his own country of Japan and the way their government handles things when he penned the script, but a lot of what is said in this movie can easily apply to any government in the world. Hell, he even names countries like America when talking about the themes of the movie in that very same interview on Nausicaa.net. While I do my best to avoid politics, as at the end of the day, I'm not a politician, political science major, or a person that likes to actively engage in political talk due to the inflammatory nature of said topic, but as an adult living in the adult world, it is something that we just can't completely avoid. But for this section, I will be avoiding as much as I possibly can, espousing my own personal beliefs to the best of my ability to remain objective and neutral when talking about Patlabor 2's themes, such as the illusion of peace. Mamoru Oshii in interviews commonly mentioned his distaste with his own government and the real-world JSDF of the time, and wanted to tell a story that made pointed criticisms at them. For example, in the opening scene of Suge's PKO mission, which was based on the real-life PKO mission where volunteer police officer Harayuki Takada was slain during an ambush by communist rebels with an RPG in Cambodia in 1993 when Khmer Rouge was in power, in an interview he was asked about what specifically his criticisms of the JSDF was when writing that scene, wondering why he didn't write for Suge to fire at the enemy combatants in defense, as well as to defend his own subordinates, to which he stated, and I quote, "I don't think today's Japanese self-defense force has that kind of professional military mindset. Comparing SDF and policemen, I think policemen have a far greater grasp of reality. Their work always requires them to work with people, An animator who did the key animation also told me, in a situation like that, of course you fire. But it's not whether you can or cannot fire. That wasn't the point. Of course, I think you can fire with your own judgment as a front commander. But that's a pure militaristic situation, and the current SDF isn't made that way. I don't think they consider PKOs as a militaristic manner. I depicted that as the reason why he could not fire. There was another issue I put in. When we ask why he didn't fire, there's an issue of that if he could really recognize the danger to his life. That's why I used the cockpit of the combat robot filled with monitors, the issue being whether you can really feel that your life is an actual danger in a situation where you are surrounded by such secondary information. He then expands further on the theme of the illusion of peace brought up by the character of Arakawa. There is a gap, even though there is a certain structure of conflict as a political idea. In terms of actual technology, there are some parts in which Japan has already surpassed the United States. From games to automobiles, it's so in Japan, and it's so outside of Japan. Even if the politicians' thinking becomes more radical, the structures are such that it won't materialize as a reality of our life. If we can think of politics as an extension of the reality of our life, no one would start a war. Because someone jumps the gun, war happens. And once it's happened, it's not good, and there is no end to it. So we have no choice but to stop. Though how we stop it is another matter. Something like opening up a prospect by expanding the territory by war, as in the old days of the era of Imperial Japan. There is no such thing anymore. There is no win or lose, in essence. The United States has no vision to bind the country other than ruling the world well within its hegemony. If they stop doing so, the country will disintegrate. Because they don't want that, they keep doing it. That's all. It is certain that the world has hit the wall, in both economic and in a political sense. The reason for this is because we've gotten the answer that everything we've been doing is no good. Just this last year in 2020, the amount of riots that happened was not something I expected to see, but it also wasn't surprising to see considering the things that happened because of it. Businesses being burned down, people's livelihoods being ruined, people who died senseless deaths at the hands of a cause that, while it started with good intentions, devolved into something much just more sinister and awful, only for TV newscasters, journalists, and politicians to use the hilariously meme-to-death word salad buzzword train to spin the riots into something more tasteful, labeling the riots as mostly peaceful protests, something so outrageously and obviously not what they actually were. The phrase mostly peaceful protests turning into a symbolic phrase of two-faced narrative spin given by our overlords in the useless vein to pretend how peaceful and great our society is, when it's clear to most people that there is something deeply wrong. All delivered to us with a smile on our monitors and smartphones, as the world we know falls apart around us in the vein of something we call peace, which comes at a cost. Not only at the cost of people like you and me in countries and flashpoints around the globe, places most people would never imagine setting foot in, but at the cost of people within our own societies as well. This is what I meant when I said Patlabor 2 is perhaps one of the most socially relevant pieces of media to this day. If Fight Club is relevant to this day due to its social critiques of society and the disenfranchisement of men in modern society, then Patlabor 2's social critiques of the idea of peace and two-faced politics is just as relevant, no matter where you are in the world. These are the things that Patlabor 2 tackles: that the idea of peace is a farce and conflict is something we can't avoid, and it's not something that can simply be wiped away with narrative spin, replacing the importance of harsh reality with useless optimism, something Oshi is so very critical of. In fact, he even admits that Tsuge is a reflection of himself and his own beliefs, yet is also self-aware enough to know that what Tsuge is doing is no more better than what his own government is doing. While Tsuge and Oshi believes peace is an illusion, there are people who live in that society that believe in said peace, and who is Tsuge, and by extension Oshi, to tell those people that their beliefs are invalid? Hell, going further, the relationship between Tsuge and Shinobu is a realization and reflection of both sides of the coin. Suge being a representation of the cynicism that Oshi holds towards his own government and the idea of peace, and Shinobu being the optimist that wants to defend that very idea of peace by bringing him into custody for his crimes against Japan. Yet when all is said and done, when Shinobu cuffs him as well as herself, linking the two together, not only is it representative of the feelings that they have for each other, it also represents a mutual understanding of each other's ideals. Suge's government failed him and his men when they refused to give the order to defend themselves against the enemy, so it's understandable why he would want to show his government fear and confusion from attacks from an invisible enemy from within, only to realize that they were too late in their response when they finally figured it out. It's also understandable why Shinobu feels he is wrong for committing crimes against their own country she swore an oath to protect, despite her own feelings about him. In the end, it's through their understanding of one another and coming to terms with their own respective realities in the aftermath of the conflict they engaged in, they can finally come to something that somewhat resembles what we call peace.
Just tell me one thing. You're the one who brought about all this misery, so why didn't you just kill yourself?
Perhaps there is a part of me that wants to see more.
See more of what?
This city's future.
And that, in my opinion, is why I feel Patlabor 2 is one of the greatest and most important animes to come out in the past 40 years. Buy this anime, whether it's the Platinum Blu-ray collection by Made in Japan, which comes highly recommended, or whether it be the solo DVDs, whichever you decide to get, they're abundant in availability, costing around $10 for the non-special edition, although I'd recommend the special edition. It's just that good. It really is. And you can find it easily on eBay and Amazon. So if you have the mind for it and are willing to sit through a film that demands your attention, I couldn't think of a better anime. Absolute classic. Well, that's it for this Anime Abyss. And speaking of which, and speaking of Mamoru Oshii, there's another film with his name on it that is absolutely in need of covering on this show. But not yet. No. We gotta eat our peas first before we eat our dessert. Next time, we're going to cover an absolute otaku classic that ultimately, at least to me, I don't think it ultimately holds up as well as it should in the modern day. Oh, sure, it looks pretty, is well animated, and overall is still brought up in conversation when it comes down to classic anime, which makes it all the more painful considering who made it. We are going to cover one of the titans of anime's past. Till next time.